The moment I understood my family no longer saw me as their mother. I was standing in my own kitchen on Christmas Eve, holding a casserole dish nobody had asked me to bring, listening to laughter drifting from the living room that stopped the instant I walked through the door. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything. I set the dish down on the counter, smoothed my sweater, and quietly went to find somewhere to sit. What my son Conrad and his wife Sylvia didn't know was that I had already begun paying attention. And once a woman my age starts paying attention, it's very difficult to make her stop. My husband Walter died 2 winters before that Christmas. Pancreatic cancer. We had 41 years together, Walter and I. 41 years of early mornings and Tim Hortons coffee and arguments about whose turn it was to shovel the driveway. He was a quiet man, but the kind of quiet that fills a room. After he was gone, the house in Kitchener felt like a building I was just passing through. For the first year, I gave Conrad and Sylvia every excuse I could think of. They were grieving too, I told myself. They had their own lives. Their children were young. People pull away when they don't know what to say to someone in pain. I believed all of it because I wanted to. The second year, I stopped believing quite so easily. It was the small things at first. Phone calls I made that went to voicemail and were returned 2 days later. Holiday gatherings where conversation paused when I entered a room. Questions about Walter's pension that came up more often than questions about how I was sleeping. My daughter-in-law Sylvia had a particular way of steering conversations away from certain topics whenever I was nearby. A slight tilt of her chin. A look across the table at Conrad, and he would immediately start talking about something else. Hockey. Weather. The Reno they were planning on the basement. I noticed. I just didn't know yet what I was noticing. That Christmas Eve, I had driven 40 minutes from Kitchener to their house in Waterloo with a roasted vegetable tart, a bottle of red wine, and a container of shortbread I'd spent the better part of 2 days making. The recipe was Walter's mother's. He'd written it out for me on a notepad from a hardware store in Guelph the first Christmas we spent together. I still had the notepad. I touched it every December before I started baking. When I arrived, Conrad opened the door. He kissed my cheek the way you kiss someone you're slightly relieved to see. Quickly, efficiently, with the door already half closing behind you. Sylvia appeared from the kitchen with a glass of wine in one hand and a look on her face that suggested she was managing something, and I had just added to the list. "Oh good, you made it!" Traffic wasn't bad. She took the tart from my hands before I could answer and disappeared back into the kitchen. Their children, my grandchildren, Theo, who was 12, and his sister Nora, who was 9, were somewhere in the house. I could hear Theo upstairs on some kind of game. Nora came running down the hall a few minutes later, wrapped her arms around my waist, and said, "Grandma, your hair looks so pretty," before she was called back by her mother for something. Conrad's brother-in-law was there. Sylvia's parents had come up from Hamilton. A couple I didn't recognize near the fireplace with drinks in their hands, laughing at something on someone's phone. I stood in the entryway for longer than I should have, still in my coat, before I realized no one was going to offer to take it. I hung it up myself. Dinner was served in the dining room. Sylvia had set a beautiful table. Cloth napkins, the good dishes, candles and glass holders, 12 chairs, 11 people. I counted quickly, the way you do when something feels slightly wrong but you can't immediately name it. Then I looked more carefully. There was no place for me at the main table. A small card table had been set up near the window at the far end of the room. Partially behind a decorative screen Sylvia used to separate the dining room from the hallway. 1 chair, 1 setting, a paper napkins instead of cloth. Conrad walked past me carrying a bread basket. "You're just over there, Mum. We ran out of matching chairs." He said it the way you'd mention a minor inconvenience. Parking situation. Slight delay on the 401. "Not? Your seat at the table where you have eaten Christmas dinner for 15 years has been given to someone else." I sat down at the small table. I didn't make a scene. I was 67 years old and I had been making other people comfortable for so long it had become something close to reflex. But I watched everything. Conrad sat near Sylvia. Her parents were on either side of them. The couple I didn't know were introduced as Sylvia's colleagues from work. Darren something and his wife. They got the 2 chairs closest to the candles. Even Sylvia's brother Marcus, who I had met perhaps 4 times in 15 years of family gatherings, sat at the main table. I ate my dinner from behind a decorative screen. Halfway through the meal, I got up to refill my water glass. The kitchen was briefly empty. A leather portfolio sat on the counter beside Sylvia's bag. The kind with a zipper, the kind people bring to meetings. It was slightly open. I wasn't trying to look. But a woman develops sharp peripheral vision when she starts to feel that things are happening around her rather than with her. I saw my name, not my whole name, just the last line of what appeared to be a typed document. Mrs. Evelyn Marsh. And beneath it, a signature line. Blank. I didn't touch it. I didn't move closer. I walked back to my small table behind the screen with my glass of water. As I sat very still and I thought about Walter. Walter had always said I was the one who noticed things. You see everything, Evie, he used to tell me. You just pretend you don't. He meant it as a compliment. I wasn't always sure he was wrong. Dessert was brought out. Sylvia's mother had made a Yule log. Someone had put my shortbread in a bowl near the coffee station, without mentioning who had brought it. 3 people ate pieces of it and complimented Sylvia, who said thank you without correcting them. I drank my coffee. I smiled when people looked in my direction. I watched Conrad and Sylvia exchange the particular kind of glances that couples exchange when they are managing information together. Small glances, quick, the kind that don't look like anything unless you know what you're looking for. After dessert, I excused myself to the restroom. In the hallway, I could hear Conrad and Sylvia talking in the kitchen. The door was mostly closed. I stood still. She didn't notice, Sylvia said. You sure? Conrad's voice was lower. She was behind the screen all night. She couldn't see it from there. A pause. The solicitor needs it before the new year, Sylvia said. We're running out of time. Conrad said something I couldn't hear. Then Sylvia more clearly. It's better if she just signs. If she understands what she's signing, she'll ask questions. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. If she understands what she's signing. I made it back to the living room before anyone noticed I'd stopped in the hallway. I sat in the armchair by the window and looked at the Christmas tree and thought, very carefully, about what I was going to do next. Around 9 o'clock, guests started gathering coats. Hugs were exchanged. Sylvia's parents said what a lovely evening. The couple from work said the food was wonderful. Conrad shook hands and laughed and said, drive safe. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I hugged Nora, who was already half asleep on the couch, and found Theo upstairs to say goodnight. Conrad walked me to the door. Drive safe, Mum. Roads might be icy. Thank you for having me, I said. And I meant it to sound exactly as polite and unrevealing as it did. I drove home through the dark. Snow was falling lightly over the 401. Christmas lights blinked in windows along the residential streets near my house. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked exactly like nothing was wrong. Inside, I sat at my kitchen table with my coat still on. The shortbread notepad was on the shelf across the room. Walter's handwriting. 41 years. I thought about the portfolio, the document, my name, at the bottom, the blank signature line. I thought about what Sylvia had said. If she understands what she's signing. Then I picked up my phone and called our family solicitor. Not Conrad's solicitor. Mine. Walter's and mine, from the beginning. A man named Douglas Hart, who had handled every piece of paperwork our family had produced for the last 30 years, who had attended Walter's retirement party and sent flowers to the funeral, and called me personally every few months since to ask if I needed anything. Douglas answered on the 3rd ring. Evelyn. His voice carried the immediate warmth of someone who understood why I was calling at 9:30 on Christmas Eve without me having to explain it. Tell me what happened. And so I did. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was hoping you'd call before this went any further. The words settled in my chest like ice. You knew something was happening. I've had concerns, he said carefully. There are questions that have been asked, through certain channels, about the structure of your estate. Questions. I wasn't asked directly. Questions I wasn't meant to know about. I stared at the shortbread notepad across the room. How long? Several months. I closed my eyes. Several months. While I had been calling Conrad on Sunday evenings and mailing Nora birthday cards, and inviting them all to Kitchener for dinners nobody came to, There had been months of questions happening somewhere behind my back. "Douglas," I said, "is there something I should know? About Walter? About what he left?" Another pause. "Longer this time. There's something Walter left with me," he said. "Not for now. But he told me clearly, that if there ever came a time when you needed to know the full picture, I was to show you." I pressed my hand flat on the table. "What did he leave?" "Come in tomorrow," Douglas said. "Bring nothing. Just yourself." I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about the document in the portfolio. The blank line where my signature was supposed to go. The solicitor, who had been asked questions through certain channels. The way Conrad had walked me to the door and said, "Drive safe as though nothing in the world," was unusual. I thought about Walter. He had been methodical, my husband. Careful with paperwork the way some people are careful with good tools. He believed things should be done properly or not at all. In his last months, when he was still well enough to be at his desk, I used to hear him typing long after I'd gone to bed. I assumed he was organizing files, closing out old accounts, the practical work of getting things in order. He told me not to worry. He said everything was taken care of. I hadn't asked enough questions. I drove to Douglas's office the morning of Christmas Day. His building was quiet, half the parking lot empty. A small wreath hung on the glass door. He met me in the reception area himself, coat still on, coffee in hand. "Merry Christmas, Evelyn! Merry Christmas, Douglas!" We didn't say much else until we were seated in his office with the door closed. He opened a locked drawer in his credenza and removed a sealed envelope. Brown, letter-sized, nothing on the outside except my name in Walter's handwriting. "Evelyn. For when you need it." I recognized the pen he'd used. A particular blue ink. He'd had the same pen for years. "He brought this to me 8 months before he passed," Douglas said quietly. "He said he hoped you'd never need it. He said if you were sitting here reading it, something had gone wrong." I held the envelope in both hands for a long moment. Then I opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages. Walter's handwriting, careful and unhurried, the way he wrote everything. "My dear Evie, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I spent a good while hoping wouldn't. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from it in person." I stopped, breathed, kept reading. He had noticed things, my husband. In the last 2 years of his life, while I had been focused on his treatments and his comfort and keeping the household running, he'd been watching Conrad. "Small things," he wrote. "Questions about the house. Questions about the RRSP. Questions about what the life insurance would look like." He said, he told himself it was grief in advance, that Conrad was trying to understand and prepare. He said he kept making excuses the same way I did, for the same reasons. Then one evening, he'd overheard a phone call. Conrad and Sylvia, discussing a property timeline. Walter had been resting in the armchair in the hallway, a chair that was partly hidden by the doorframe, and Conrad hadn't known he was there. Walter wrote, "I want to believe the best of our son. I raised him to be better than what I heard that evening. But I cannot leave you without protection, simply because I want to believe." My hands were shaking. He had restructured things. Douglas explained while I read. The house, which I had assumed was in both our names, had been transferred solely into mine. 2 years before Walter died. A quiet re-registration that Conrad wouldn't have noticed unless he'd specifically checked. There was also a lakeside property, a small cabin in the Bruce Peninsula that we'd bought the year Theo was born, which Walter had registered in my name alone from the beginning. He had also left something else, a USB drive, tucked inside the envelope behind the letter. I held it up. Douglas nodded. "He asked me not to look at it. He said it was for you and that you would know when to use it." I put it in my pocket. My phone had been buzzing since mid-morning. Conrad twice, Sylvia once. A text from Conrad that said, "Merry Christmas, Mum. Hope you slept well." Nothing in the message acknowledged that I had left their house 8 hours ago, without anyone truly noticing the moment I walked out. They hadn't noticed for nearly an hour. I knew because Nora had called me just before midnight, her small voice worried, asking if I'd made it home safely. She'd found me gone and apparently no one else had thought to check. I texted Conrad back, "Merry Christmas." Spending the day quietly, I put the phone face down on Douglas's desk. He walked me through the estate documents carefully. Everything Walter had arranged was designed with the same intention, to ensure that no single person and no pressure could move anything without my direct and fully informed consent. Multiple checkpoints. Legal reviews built into the structure. It wasn't complicated, but it was thorough. It was Walter being methodical long after he was no longer there to be methodical in person. Douglas said. He told me once that he trusted Conrad, but he trusted the paperwork more. That sounded exactly like my husband. I drove home with the USB drive in my coat pocket and Walter's letter folded in my bag. The snow had stopped. The roads were clear and quiet in the way. Christmas morning roads always are in Ontario, empty, and somehow a little sacred. I passed a church with its lights on and people in winter coats moving slowly toward the entrance, and I thought about Walter attending Christmas Eve service with me. Every year for 40 years. How he always chose the end of the pew so he could stretch his legs. How he always fell changed. How he always fell asleep for exactly 7 minutes during the sermon and woke up looking entirely unbothered about it. I missed him in a way that didn't have a name. Back home I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the USB drive. Then I found Walter's old laptop in the study closet. He had kept it charged, a habit he said he'd never break, and I plugged in the drive. There were 3 folders. Documents. Audio. A file simply called Read First. I opened Read First. It was a short note, just a paragraph. Evie, this is everything I found, and couldn't prove and couldn't bring myself to tell you while I was still here because I wanted our last months to be ours. I'm sorry for that, but I need you to have it. The audio file is from a recording I made by accident during a phone call in the study. I had left the computer recording a voice memo and forgot. You'll know why it matters when you hear it. The documents folder contains copies of things I found in Conrad's car one afternoon when I borrowed it and found papers in the glove box I wasn't meant to see. I put them back exactly as I found them. I photographed them first. I love you more than I know how to say. W. My tea went cold. I listened to the audio. It was Conrad and Sylvia. They didn't know they were being recorded. That much was obvious from the first 30 seconds. They were at the kitchen table at our house, speaking the way people speak when they think they're alone. Walter must have been in the study. The voice memo software had captured everything through the open door. The conversation was 42 minutes long. I didn't listen to all of it that afternoon. I got through perhaps half before I had to stop and walk to the window and stand there looking at the snow on the back garden until I felt steady enough to continue. What I heard was this. A plan that had been forming for at least 2 years before Walter died. A plan that had accelerated since. Conrad and Sylvia discussing the house in Kitchener, the cabin in the Bruce Peninsula. What they could be listed for. What the proceeds might look like. Whether I would agree to a power of attorney, or whether, as Sylvia said in a voice that I will hear for the rest of my life, they would need to demonstrate that Mum was having trouble managing things on her own. Demonstrate. Not discover. Not worry about. Demonstrate. I turned the laptop off. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I did something I had been putting off for over a year. I called my friend Judith Rollins, who had been my closest friend since we taught together at Centennial Public School in the 90s, and who had been gently suggesting for months that something felt off to her about Conrad and Sylvia. I had defended them every time. I told her I was imagining things. I told her they were just busies. Just stressed, just grieving in their own way. I know, she said when I finished telling her everything. Just those 2 words, gentle and not unkind. She came over within the hour. She brought soup. We sat at my kitchen table and I played her parts of the audio and she held my hand and didn't say anything that began with "I told you." She was a better friend than I deserved in that moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm not signing anything." The calls from Conrad continued over the following days. His messages shifted in a way that was difficult to miss if you were watching for it. The first few were warm, almost performatively warm. Checking in. Asking how I was, suggesting we have dinner soon. Thens, around the 3rd day, a different register appeared. He mentioned in passing that there were some financial matters he'd been meaning to discuss with me. Some things Walter had set up that were a little complicated, and that he and Sylvia could help me sort through if I wanted. Sort through. The 4th day, Sylvia called. She said she hoped I wasn't spending too much time alone. She said that she and Conrad only wanted to make sure I was looked after properly. She said there were some options worth considering, just for my peace of mind, just to take the pressure off. I thanked her and said I had some things to attend to. What I had to attend to was a meeting with Douglas, and then a second meeting with a woman Douglas recommended. A specialist in elder law named Frances Okafor, who had an office in downtown Kitchener and who had heard versions of this story before. Frances was direct and careful, and looked at me across her desk with the steady attention of someone who was not going to suggest I might be misreading the situation. She reviewed the documents from Walter's USB drive. She listened to portions of the audio. She read the paperwork Douglas had prepared. The document in the portfolio, she said. The one you saw at Christmas. We need to find out what it is. I don't know who prepared it. We can find out. She made a note. In the meantime, the protections your husband established are solid. No one can move these assets without your direct, witnessed, and legally reviewed consent. But we need to make sure nothing has already been moved. I hadn't considered that. The next hour was not comfortable. Frances made calls. Douglas provided records. By the end of the afternoon, we had confirmed that no transfers had yet occurred. The accounts, the house, the cabin were all exactly where they were supposed to be. But there was a filing, a preliminary one, connected to an estate planning firm that neither Walter nor I had ever used, filed without my knowledge. With my name on it, and a signature that was not mine, I looked at the document for a long time. It wasn't a perfect forgery. My signature has a particular hook at the end of the M that I've had since I was 12 years old and broke my wrist and had to relearn cursive in a cast. It wasn't there. Frances was very still when she looked at it. "Evelyn," she said, "this is a serious matter. I know. How would you like to proceed?" I thought about Christmas Eve. The small table behind the screen, the paper napkin, the shortbread that no one attributed to me, the way Conrad had walked me to the door and said drive safe as though he were entirely at peace. "I want to meet with them," I said, "with Conrad and Sylvia. I want to do it with you present, and with Douglas present, and I want there to be documentation." Frances nodded. "And I want to do it before they realize that I know." The meeting was arranged for the second week of January, just after New Year's. A Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, in the boardroom at Frances's office. I arrived early. Douglas was already there. Frances had arranged for a colleague to be present as well, a quiet man named Paul, who sat near the wall and took notes and did not speak unless spoken to. Conrad and Sylvia arrived together. Conrad had on his good coat. Sylvia carried a leather bag, a different one from Christmas Eve, but the same manner, the same efficiency. They stopped just inside the doorway when they saw Douglas and Frances. Conrad looked at me. "Mum, what is this? Please sit down," I said. Something passed across his face. Not guilt, not exactly. Something more complicated. He sat. Sylvia sat beside him. Frances opened a folder and set several documents on the table. The estate paperwork Douglas had prepared. The property records. The filing from the estate planning firm neither Walter nor I had authorized. The document with the signature that was not mine. Nobody spoke. Finally, Conrad said, "I can explain. I'd like you to wait," I said. He closed his mouth. Frances went through everything methodically. The unauthorized filing. The forged signature. The audio recording from Walter's laptop. She described its contents without playing it. "There would be time for that later," she said, "if it became necessary." Sylvia had gone very still. Her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the documents. She was looking at the table. Conrad was looking at me. When Frances finished, I spoke. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I'd like you to answer honestly because I think you'll find it's the better choice." Conrad nodded. "Were you ever going to tell me what you were planning?" A long silence. "We were trying to protect you," he said. I had expected that. I had rehearsed my response in the kitchen the night before, standing at the counter with my hands around a mug of tea. "Protect me from what, Conrad?" He couldn't answer. Sylvia shifted in her chair. Her jaw was tight. "From making the wrong decisions?" I continued. "From keeping a house you decided I didn't need? From asking questions about documents with my name on them?" I kept my voice calm. "I'm 67. I'm in good health. I drive myself to appointments, and I'm a finance, and I read the news every morning, and I bake shortbread from a recipe your father memorized for me before you were born." At what point did you decide I needed to be managed? Conrad's eyes had reddened. Whether it was shame or grief or something else, I couldn't entirely tell. Sylvia spoke then, her voice was controlled, but her hands had tightened in her lap. The house is worth a great deal, she said. We have debt that. She stopped. Conrad looked at her sharply. But she'd said it. We have debt. Not. We were worried about you. Not. We thought you'd be happier somewhere smaller. Debt. Frances set another document on the table. A financial summary that her colleague had prepared, with information obtained through legal channels. A second mortgage on Conrad and Sylvia's home. Business losses from a partnership Sylvia had entered 3 years ago that had not been disclosed to Conrad's family. Loans. Obligations. Sylvia looked at the summary. Then she looked at nothing. Conrad's face, as he read it, changed in ways I found difficult to watch. Not because I didn't understand, I understood completely. I just hadn't expected that he hadn't known, or hadn't let himself know. Conrad, I said quietly. He looked up. I am your mother, not a problem to be solved. He looked down at the table when he looked up again. His eyes were wet. I know, he said. I know, Mum. There wasn't much more to say after that, not in that room. Frances outlined the legal next steps clearly, and without drama. The unauthorized filing would be addressed. The forged signature was a matter now in the hands of the appropriate people. The estate protections Walter had established were confirmed, in writing, in front of witnesses. Sylvia didn't speak again during the meeting. When it ended, she stood, gathered her bag, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. I'm sorry, Evelyn, she said. She didn't look at me when she said it. I chose to believe she meant it anyway, because people in desperate circumstances make choices that don't reflect who they wanted to be, and understanding that doesn't require excusing it. Conrad stayed a few minutes after Sylvia left. We sat across from each other with the empty coffee cups between us. I didn't think it would get this far, he said. I know. And I did. That was the hard part. I believed him. Conrad had never been unkind, not truly. He had been weak in a particular direction, and that direction had been pointed at me. But it did get this far, and we have to start from where we actually are, he nodded. Can we? He stopped. Started again. Is there a way back? I thought about the small table behind the screen, the paper napkin, the document with the wrong signature. Not to where we were, I said. But maybe somewhere better, if we're honest. That was January. By March, I had made 2 decisions. The first was practical. I updated my estate documents with Frances and Douglas, with full transparency about everything, who would receive what, and why. Nora and Theo were named clearly as beneficiaries for the cabin in the Bruce Peninsula. Not Conrad, not Sylvia, but their children. The children who had never asked me about property or asset values, or what things would look like once they were older. The children who had called me grandma like it was the most straightforward word in the world. The second decision was about the house in Kitchener. I put it on the market in April. Not because anyone forced me to. Not because I was punishing anyone. Because I was 67 years old, and Walter was gone, and the house had 4 bedrooms, and I had been rattling around in it like a pea in a tin for 2 winters, and it was time. I moved to a condominium near Victoria Park. Smaller. Quieter. A kitchen with south-facing windows where the light came in long and slow in the afternoons, and made the whole place feel like something I had chosen on purpose, which I had. Judith helped me move. A woman from my old school board, a retired vice principal named Helen Chambers, came over with wine the first weekend, and we sat on my balcony and watched the park below, and talked about nothing important for 3 hours, and it was the best evening I'd had in years. By summer, I had joined a Saturday morning walking group that left from the park. 9 women, ranging in age from 58 to 74. We walked 5 kilometers, and then went for coffee. Nobody talked about property values. Nobody managed anyone. We talked about books and grown children, and the particular exhaustion of caring about people who sometimes made it difficult, and the unexpected pleasure of reaching an age where you were no longer interested in pretending otherwise. Conrad called, and kept calling. The early calls were stilted and brief. By summer they were a little easier. He and Sylvia were in counseling. He told me this without me askings, which I thought was a meaningful thing to volunteer. He was working through his own understandings of what had happened, of what he'd allowed to happen, of the particular kind of looking away that had let things go as far as they did. I didn't forgive him quickly because that wouldn't have been honest. But I didn't refuse to speak to him either, because that also would have not been honest. He was my son. The same son who used to fall asleep on the couch with his shoes on during Saturday afternoon hockey games and wake up, insisting he'd been watching the whole time. People contain more than one thing. That's what makes forgiveness both necessary and complicated. Nora started calling me on her own that spring. Little calls, 9-year-old calls, calls about a friendship problem at school, or a book she'd finished, or something funny that had happened in gym class. I looked forward to them more than I could properly explain. They were calls from someone who wanted to talk to me, not calls from someone managing a situation, and the difference was enormous. One afternoon in September, Nora called to tell me about a science project she was doing on migration patterns. Birds migrate because it gets cold, she said, with the authority of a 9-year-old who has recently acquired information, but also because there's more food somewhere else. They don't leave because they want to. They leave because where they're going is better. That's interesting, I said. I thought of you when I read it. I laughed. I was standing at my kitchen window with the south light coming in, the park below full of September color, the coffee in my hand still warm. Did you? Because you moved, she said. And I think where you went is better. I didn't say anything for a moment. Yes, I said finally. I think you're right. Some people will read this and think the lesson is about money, or about legal documents, or about protecting your assets when you're older, and the people around you begin to make decisions about your life before you've agreed to stop making them yourself. Those things matter. But they're not the lesson. The lesson I keep coming back to, on the mornings when I walk the park route alone, or sit at my kitchen window, with Walter's shortbread in front of me, and think about the last 2 years, is simpler than that. You are allowed to be seen clearly, you are allowed to insist on it, and if the people who are supposed to love you most have stopped seeing you, stopped really looking, you are allowed to stand up from the small table in the corner, put on your coat, and find somewhere you fit better. It is not giving up, it is not bitterness, it is not abandoning anyone. It is simply remembering that you were always worth more than a paper napkin and a chair behind a screen. And it is never, at any age, too late to sit at a table where everyone present is glad you came.